So welcome to the final prac for this course. So today we're going through the 2014 past paper. We're going to start from the back of the paper and work our way through because we didn't get too much time to talk about the essay questions when we did the 2012 paper. So we'll start with question 7, which is the question that looks at the enforcement guidelines, and then we'll work backwards from that. Alrighty, everyone. Let's start with the last question on the 2014 paper. So we'll start at the back, and we'll work our way to the front. So you'll see that you'll remember you get a choice of 2 out of 3 essay questions. So you'll get to make a call during the exam whether you are going to do the enforcement response question, whether you're going to do one about a major project or whether you're going to do one about mining. So you'll know that you'll have a choice of 2 out of 3 from those topics. And as you also would have gathered by now, you can come in with a sense of what you want your model answer to look like, you know, how you're going to sort of set it out in terms of describing different processes. So if we look at question 7, it's very similar to what we saw in the 2012 paper. It's just a different factual scenario. So this one is saying you're employed by the Queensland Department of Environment and Heritage Protection in Townsville as an environmental officer. Your responsibilities include enforcement of the Environmental Protection Act. Cyclone Ita has caused heavy rain in the region in early 2014, and a large volume of water was released from tailings dams for toxic waste at the Yabula Nickel refinery, located north of Townsville and operated by Queensland Nickel. DEHP inspectors found water from the tailings dam was spilling into local waterways that flow to the nearby Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. Then it lists out the different discretionary powers that the EPA has under the Environmental Protection Act and how they can respond. And then afterwards it says, advise your manager on the appropriate enforcement action to take, if any. Your answer should explain the reasons for your recommendation for or against choosing each of the enforcement options listed above, and your reasons should be based on the department's enforcement guidelines. So obviously you need to make sure you've got those enforcement guidelines with you in the exam, and you're going to structure your answer according to the structure of those enforcement guidelines. It's a good idea to use headings as you're answering these questions, and you know, to sort of try and keep it clear as you're going from one step to the next. So what are the key facts here? What are the things that we need to be looking at in those facts to decide what enforcement action to take? It's a contaminant, so that the nature of the thing that was released. Yeah. Okay. What else?
If there are any precautions taken to stop it from happening.
Okay, if there are any precautions taken. What else?
Who is responsible?
Yeah, something more vital. Remember the tables that you have to look at in the enforcement guidelines? What are you looking at? How serious the impact is on the environment. Right. So you need to understand the impact and the nature of the receiving environment. So how sensitive is the receiving environment to what was being released? And where does the local waterway flow to? The nearby Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. Okay, so you know that the thing that is spilling out is heavily polluted, so it's got the risk there of causing serious environmental harm, and you know that it's flowing into a very sensitive receiving environment. Okay, so the facts that you were getting there were pointing you in a very particular direction in terms of highlighting that there could be serious harm. It's a very sensitive environment. But you would obviously be pointing out here that what you don't have is information on the actual harm caused or all of the circumstances behind how that release took place and what reaction there was to contain it and so on. So at this point what you can see is there's nothing in the facts that's telling you that immediate action was taken to contain the release. You know, in the one we looked at last time, it showed it was accidental and that all of the cleanup procedures were immediately followed and so on. This isn't in your facts, which means that when you're using that critical thinking, that insight, you can point out that that probably means that cleanup action has not been taken. It tells you, in fact, that the inspectors have found that water is spilling into the local waterways, so factually it's telling you it's still happening. And that's going to influence your decision in terms of deciding what enforcement action to take, because remember, you've got to think about what's the purpose of this enforcement action. So in this case, the purpose behind the enforcement action is to stop that release from the tailings dam and to, you know, contain and remediate. So what that means is you would obviously go through all the different options, but clearly you need more investigation of the harm that's being caused, and some sort of clean-up notice is probably the most logical choice here, because it's then containing the contaminant and it's doing something to address the possibility of serious harm. And if you have a look and you look at C, it says that you can issue a clean-up notice requiring them to prevent or minimize contamination, to rehabilitate or restore, to assess the nature and extent of the environmental harm from the incident, including inspecting, sampling, recording, measuring, and to keep the department informed about the incident and any actions taken under the notice. Okay, so is there any... Yep?
Can you issue a clean-up notice and also fine them? Or is it like pick one?
You would, because remember, you would need to know the extent of the harm to then determine the extent of the penalty. So, and you could certainly point that out in your answer, that further action may then, you know, once that investigation is completed, once the incident has been properly assessed and contained, because, you know, that containment is the priority. Once that's done, then you would recommend the department revisited it and considered whether the penalties or, in fact, you know, proceedings should be taken, depending on the level of fault. Because that's the thing we don't know, do we? We don't know the level of fault and we don't know the level of harm, so that's why we want to investigate.
At what level of harm does it become like a criminal prosecution? Is that like...
Remember there's that financial component to it. So it goes... So there's those thresholds of the dollar figure that you can present in terms of how much harm is caused, how much it costs to clean it up. So that's one factor you can look at.
Okay.
Yeah. It's more about showing that you're considering the options and you're applying them to the facts as you know them, or you're highlighting the additional information you would need. So it's again, it's not that idea of, you know, technical perfection, it's more that analysis around it.
In this case, when we're answering this question, do we have to go through A's through to F? And yeah, okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, remember, so it says in the question, Your answer should explain the reasons for your recommendations for or against choosing each of the enforcement options. Yeah, make sure you do that because you'll miss out on a lot of marks if you don't go through each one. Yeah. And so, for example, you would say, taking no action. Well, there's a real threat to the environment here, so this would not be, a recommended course of action. Next one, writing a warning letter. Well, this is something that would take time to process, and we would need a more immediate response to the incident. So you sort of go through, yeah. All right, should we look at the mining one next? So question 6, so we're going backwards to question 6. We've got an Xstrata coal mine. So it says, you act for Xstrata, the world's largest exporter of seaborne thermal coal used to generate electricity. It proposes to construct the Wandoan coal mine near the town of Wandoan, 350 kilometres northwest of Brisbane in the Surat Basin. The mine is proposed to produce approximately 900 million tonnes of product coal over a 30-year life of mine. Assuming an average price for thermal coal of $100 a tonne, the gross value of the product coal is Australian 90 billion. The mine will be comprised of 14 pits, several of which are 25 kilometres squared in area and 70 metres deep, see figure 2. The coal will be transported by rail to Gladstone for export to predominantly Asian markets. The land on which the mine is proposed is currently used for cattle grazing. Xstrata has purchased the pastoral leases covering the majority of the proposed mine. It currently holds an exploration permit covering the land. Local landholders are concerned about the mine's impacts on groundwater, and conservation groups allege the mine will contribute to climate change. Advise your client on the major mining and environmental approvals that it may need to obtain for the proposed mine, any opportunities that surrounding landholders or others may have to object to it, how the mine is assessed by the government, and what controls are likely to apply to the mine if it is approved. If further information is needed to know what approvals are required, explain what that information is. Also advise your client on any statutory processes that it may apply for to give the project special status and to facilitate the assessment and approval of the mine. Explain the practical benefits that any such processes may have for the mine. Now this is 20 marks and it says allow up to 40 minutes to answer the question. Now what you will see is in those last 2 paragraphs there are a lot of sub-questions that you specifically have to answer. So in the exam you would make sure that you numbered each of them, right, so that you're clear that you've ticked them all off, and make sure you've got a heading for each one as you go, so it's very clear to the marker that you have addressed each of those dot points. Now, the way it's very similar to the questions where you look at major projects. So it's the same idea. You can write up your own summary of the mining approvals and the EPBC Act as they would apply to mines. And then you can bring that summary in with you and modify it for the particular facts that you're going to see in the exam. So what sort of things do you think you'd want to be talking about when you talk about the mining approvals? Which pieces of legislation would apply? I'm stretching your memories here. Like mining? Mining was a long time ago. Do you think you'd do this question in the exam? No. So you'd go major projects and you'd go enforcement guidelines. Because you have to do 2. So if you decide you're not going to do mining, it means you'd have to do the other 2.
Those are always the 3 options?
Yeah, and it's in the information for the exam that those are your 3 options. Yeah, we're very kind. But obviously, if you think you're going to do the mining question, you need to have that summary ready to go. Okay, so you need to remember the Mineral Resources Act is going to apply, right, for a mine. So they're going to need a mining lease under the Mineral Resources Act. So you'd need to talk about all the requirements there for getting approval under the Mineral Resources Act. And they also need to hold an environmental authority under the Environmental Protection Act. So you would go through and talk about all the requirements there. How are mines assessed? What would they probably go through? How are the impacts from mines assessed? EIS, okay, so you want to talk about the fact that an EIS would probably be required. You talk about the processes for an EIS. And you'll need to talk about the criteria that would apply when they assess the application for both the mining lease and the environmental authority. So remember the standard criteria that we talked about. And what about, what was the question? Where is it on? What about opportunities for landholders or others to object to it?
Is that like subjective? Do you say?
No, it's not subjective at all. Purely, it's incredibly procedural. So remember, they have to have made a public submission in order to have standing to then bring an objections hearing in the land court. So if they haven't made a public submission, then they don't have standing to bring an objection. And what about the statutory processes that the miner could apply for to give the project special status? Talked about it in the lecture last week.
It's what all of today is going to be. Spending the whole day catching up and summarising and studying.
Try and come to the lecture on Friday, because I'll go through and talk about the key points of each topic. Any ideas?
If it's a critical infrastructure project, is that?
So yeah, so it can be a coordinated project. Yeah. Under what act? What's the acronym?
SDPWO.
Yep, so make sure you know the full name. Only for your own purposes, so you understand what you're then talking about when you look at the other slides I have on what it means. So that's the State Development and Public Works Organisation Act. Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? And then what other piece of legislation do you need to talk about? EPBC Act. Okay, so you need to go through and discuss the processes under the EPBC Act. So you need to discuss the different matters of national environmental significance.
It was a little little one.
Can we like just quote sections of like the EPBC Act, or do we just say under section S, blah 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 blah?
You're saying, like, do we need to write out
Like, do
exactly
we have
what's
to write
in
the
the thing?
whole like?
Certainly for something like this, you need to be showing that you understand the different matters. So you would want to be
Like
listing them.
dot points.
Dot points is fine, but you need to be listing them
Yeah.
because you might not have enough facts to be able to identify all of the matters of national environmental significance. So what you're doing is you're saying, yes, I understand, because not everyone does understand that it's only when those things are triggered that the matters of national environmental significance that the EPBC Act applies. So if you don't list those things, then you're not distinguishing yourself from the students that go, yeah, EPBC Act, but then they haven't got an explanation for why they're talking about the EPBC Act. So it's not one of those things where you just throw your eggs in one basket and hope that it sticks. You have to sort of explain, well, why are you discussing the EPBC Act? What's the, have you actually cottoned on to why you need to talk about it? And then you'll need to talk about the processes under the EPBC Act, so the process for referral, the process for assessment, and the process for approval.
Wouldn't all mining activity
No.
Only, so it's dependent on where it is.
It's dependent on where it is, it's dependent on what it interferes with, it's dependent on groundwater impacts. So remember, there's a trigger for groundwater, but not all mines are going to have groundwater impacts. And remember, it has to be likely to have a significant impact on those matters of national environmental significance. So yes, not all coal mines will trigger the EPBC Act. And then the last thing you'd want to talk about is the interrelationship between what happens with the state approvals and the EPBC Act, so the fact that we've got these bilateral agreements for the assessment process. Okay, so that's the mining question. Just for your information, when you're in the exam, you probably don't even notice this. This is just something that Chris McGrath has done over the years. Is every single one of these examples is a real life example. So it's a real site layout plan for a mine. The facts are all accurate. As I found out when I sat down to write the paper, I had to then go and find exact layouts, and everything is real scenarios. So, you know, if you have a moment to chuckle to yourself, you can enjoy the fact that I went to a lot of effort to give you real examples in your paper. Thanks, Chris. All right, let's look at question 5. So this is your sort of major projects question. It's going to be something to do with the major developments. You can have your model answer ready to go. So this is... Oops. All my papers. Okay. So this is Pendanus, owns land it wants to develop as a caravan park at Ewell Point near Port Douglas in North Queensland. The land is described as, and there's your lot in SR, hectares, close to a beach, 66 cabins, 40 powered caravan sites, powered camping sites, unpowered camping sites, a pool, a barbecue, office block, manager's house, amenities, toilet blocks, 2 storage sheds. See figure 1. As I said before, that's a real example of the actual proposal. It says the western half of the land was previously cleared for a sugarcane farm that is now abandoned. The eastern half of the land is covered by native vegetation and mangroves. The eastern boundary borders a national park that is part of the Wet Tropics World Heritage Area, and neighbouring landholders oppose the proposal. And it says, advise your client on the major planning and environmental approvals that it may need to obtain to undertake the proposed development, and any opportunities that the neighbours may have to object to it. If further information is needed to know what approvals are required, explain what that information is. It's 20 marks. It says allow up to 40 minutes to answer this question. So, so this again is one of those ones where you want to come in with your model answer, and you need to be talking about the Sustainable Planning Act about 3/4 of your time, and then the EPBC Act for about 1/4 of your time. That's the way the marks will be allocated. So about 3/4 of the marks to the processes under the Sustainable Planning Act, and about 1/4 of the marks will go to your discussion of the EPBC Act. And if you're not sure where to start with your handouts. So, for example, start with the one that you were given about the IDAS system. So you had your flow chart that you were given on the IDAS system and how it works. It gives you all the different categories of development. So it talks about exempt development, self-accessible, and so on and so forth. So you would want to, first of all, you want to talk about the different types of development. So that's the stuff at the top. You want to talk about material change of use. You want to talk about operational works, and so on and so forth. Then you want to talk about your categories, and then you're going to talk about, how do you decide what the assessment process is? So where do you look? And that's when you would be pointing out the additional information that you would need to know in order to find out what the assessment was for the different types of development. And yeah, this is basically this sort of handout. Basically, it's going to take you step by step through that, and then the other one that you've got, the other handout that's really useful is the one that points out the different EIS processes. So this is the one that's got all the different flow charts for you that explain the different EIS processes under the different pieces of legislation. So that's another really good one to use. And you can structure your answer in terms of following the way the processes go. So when your development application is made, the information request, public notification if it's going through EIS. The fact that public submissions could be made during the public notification period, and of course you need to make sure you talk about the potential for appeals. So the fact that these decisions can be appealed. And then for the EPBC Act, you've got a handout for that one as well. So you've got this handout here that talks about the EPBC Act. Again, it goes through the different processes. It's talking about the different sections that apply for each of the matters of national environmental significance and so on. Okay, and so that's how you would be structuring your answer. So make use of the handouts. They were there to help guide you through this process of coming up with your model answer. And as I said when we did the 2012 exam, it's completely okay to work in small groups and use your peers around you to come up with a good model answer, because when you get into the exam, you are all going to have to then modify it to the facts that you've been given in the question. So you'll end up making it original to yourself because you need to keep referring it back to the facts that you've been given. So you'll all end up with different looking answers anyway. So that's completely okay to do that. Are there any questions on that one, or should we keep going?
Do you treat the proposal as one whole unit? In other words, being that it's built over different types of areas like native vegetation, abandoned farm, borders of the park, whatever. Do you treat the little sub areas of the proposal under the different sort of?
If you believe that's going to change the IDAS process.
So it can be split.
Would it change the IDAS process? Look into it. Remember, this is the IDAS process, not.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. But certainly, once you let's say, for example, you were talking about the different types of development. Okay, so you might talk about subdivisions, and you might talk about reconfiguring a lot, and you might talk about the operational works, and you might talk about the building works. That might be the point where you point out that these are for different aspects of the build.
Yeah. Okay.
And so, that the operational works on particular areas of vegetation might have a different level of assessment. Yeah. Just don't get too fragmented. Try and keep it, because you are being marked on how you're presenting that argument, that flow. Yeah. Okay, question 4. Let's look at question 4. You act as a consultant advising a company on the redevelopment of an old industrial area into a residential estate. The market value of the redeveloped site is expected to be well over 250 million, but the development requires extensive remediation of contaminated land. Explain your professional duties and ethical obligations in the following situations. You've got 3 sub-questions there. It's worth 5 marks for all of them, and it says to allow about 10 minutes to answer these questions. So keep your eye on the time when you're doing these questions, because you've got the essays ahead of you, and any more time that you spend on these, you're going to be eating into your time for the essay questions. So just try and be quite strict with yourself about how you're doing for time, because as soon as you start eating into your time for the essay, you're eating into the bigger marks that are coming there.
Would you recommend starting with essays?
Or I don't know. I mean, it depends on whether you're the type of person that likes to get everything else under your belt and say, okay, I've done all the the itty-bitty bits, and now I can just focus my mind just on these essays. Everyone's different, so it's more about time management than it is about the order you do them in. So the advice from Chris has always been stick to that time, and don't skip any questions. As soon as you skip a question, you're then taking away the opportunity to get a minimum of 50% of those marks, so you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. So move through them all, giving it your best first go type thing.